In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace this coolant crossover assembly on this Dodge Grand Caravan. This is where the thermostat bolts on, so let's get started. Now let's drain the coolant. On the driver's side, you'll see this red plug right here. This is your radiator petcock, so we're going to have to unthread that to let coolant drain out. Make sure you have a collection bucket underneath to catch all that coolant. Put a flathead screwdriver in here and turn it counterclockwise. You could also grab it with pliers if that's what you have. Basically, spin this until coolant comes out. Do not take it all the way out. Just let it drain like this because it's a more controlled drainage as opposed to taking it out, which will actually make things shoot straight out the back. Remove the radiator cap to let coolant drain a lot faster. With the coolant drained, let's close off the petcock, make sure it's nice and snug. When you tighten this up, don't over tighten it, just snug it up a little bit. There is a rubber gasket in there that will seal everything up. On the passenger side, let's remove the air intake box, which is also the filter housing. I'm going to start by disconnecting this clamp over here. You'll see it has an 8mm bolt on it. Unthread this a few turns. That should loosen up this clamp. While I'm here, I'm also going to pull this PCV hose off. You should be able to do this. And we need to also unbolt the power steering reservoir from this air filter housing with a 13mm socket. Remove that nut. Pull this up and off. I'm going to put this nut back on so that it doesn't get lost. This we're going to have to bungee cord out of our way. But now we should be able to pull this air filter housing straight up. It's just secured onto a couple rubber grommets. So go up, get everything out of the way. There we go. Now with the help of a floor jack, let's raise up the passenger side of the engine. I have a rubber pad on my floor jack so that it doesn't damage the oil pan. And I'm going to raise on the edge of it, preferably on the corner, so that you have that bend on the oil pan supporting it. If you go on the center of it where it's flat, you're just going to crush it. When I raise this up, I'm just trying to relieve pressure off of that engine mount. I'm not actually lifting the engine a whole lot. Just so you can have an idea of what it looks like from the top, this is as much as I want to raise it right here. That's it. Be careful of this line right here. This is your main fuel feed line, so you don't want to damage it. But now let's remove all of these fasteners that hold this onto the engine mount. Doesn't matter where you start. I'm going to start with these two 13mm mounting nuts. If you supported the engine properly, this should be pretty much loose now. Next, let's take off these three 16mm mounting bolts. All three are the same, so no need to keep them separate. Lift up this plate. Now using some pliers, let's remove this clamp that holds the radiator hose onto the thermostat housing. Pinch it, pull it back a little. Now grab onto the hose, pull it off here. There is still coolant in it, I can hear it, so I'm going to put a collection bucket underneath. Now there are two 10mm bolts holding this housing on. This is one of them. And right underneath, where you can't really see it very well, is the other one. Once that's out, you should be able to pull the thermostat housing off with its gasket. Now there are four fasteners that we have to remove. This lower one is a 13mm. I'm going to take that one out first. Okay, that's going to have to stay in there. You can pull the engine mount off and then take that bolt off, but it doesn't really need to happen. And then the other three are going to be 16mm in size. So I'm going to get those off as well. Okay. With all of them out. Now they won't come out, like I said, but they'll stay with this mount. You can pull this off. Now grab some pliers and let's get the heater hose off of here. This clamp does not look too great, so I'm going to inspect it once it's off. That way I can make sure that it's reusable, and if it's not, I'm obviously going to replace it. There we go. You can very gently grab this hose with some pliers and just give it a quick twist to break it free. Slide the hose off. And now there are a bunch of 10mm bolts that we have to remove in order to get this assembly off. All right, with all of them removed, you should be able to pull this right off. And the gasket, of course, here it is. Let's clean up the surface. I put some rags in these two ports so that I avoid debris getting in there. And because there's so much of this debris, sand, and corrosion built up, I'm going to start with a wire brush, just to knock all of the larger stuff off of here. Then I'll get a razor blade and scrape off the surface here, so I can actually get a nice, better, clean seal on the new gasket. I recommend using a razor blade over anything else because a razor blade will leave a very clean surface behind without damaging the aluminum material that is here. So you want to make sure that you don't gouge it. If you do, if you use a sanding disc or sandpaper or anything like that, you can use sandpaper on a sanding block, but make sure it's very fine. But like I said, if you use anything rough, it's going to gouge the metal here, and then the gasket won't seal up. Because I have those ports blocked off, I'm able to spray brake parts cleaner in there without it getting inside the engine. I'm also going to make sure I get all this debris off of the serpentine belt, whether it's coolant or dust, sand, whatever got on there. If you have compressed air, blow it off so it can dry off quickly. Now take your new assembly. I'm upgrading to an all aluminum piece so that it's less likely to fail. I'm going to start in basically the first bolt that I can get to. This one here is easy to reach, so I'm going to start this one and then one other one so that it can stay in place. Keep in mind there are 4 short bolts and 7 long ones. You can tell that which one goes where because, well, clearly they won't fit unless it's the right bolt. They're different enough to where well, you can't really accidentally put them in the wrong place. So I'm just going to thread in all the short ones and now start in the rest of them, which are all the long ones. If any of them are corroded or they look like they're in poor condition, replace them. Otherwise these can break, they'll fail, and you also don't want them to ruin the threads where they thread into. So, all right, let's bottom all these out. Don't go too tight on them when you bottom them out because of course we will come back to torque them. I will go in a cross pattern to bottom these out so I can seat this gasket evenly. Because this is a rubber gasket, it'll squish as you tighten it down, so I'm just going to go over all of these by hand before I bring in the torque wrench so that I can make sure they're all even. As you can see, some of them will loosen up. Just get them close so that you don't spend forever with the torque wrench, which is a lot larger than this. The torque for these is 97 inch-pounds, converts to 8.1 foot-pounds. If you don't have a torque wrench that goes that low, just make them nice and snug by hand. After they bottom out, which is pretty much this, give them about 1/8 of a turn. You should be right about there. Basically, just squish that rubber gasket a little bit so that it can seal up. And just like when I snugged them, I'm going to go in a cross pattern. now just double check them all. You don't have to go in a cross pattern this time. Just go around and make sure they're all tightened properly. All right, that's torqued. Grab this hose, slide it back over. I looked at my clamp and, well, it's still pretty strong. I can barely even squish it by hand, so I'm going to reuse it. If you can reuse these spring clamps, it's a good idea. I'm gonna slide this right over the hose, exactly where it was. If you put them back in their exact spot, it's a lot more likely to seal up properly. This is good right here. I can tell that there's a little bit left in the hose for it to bottom out, so I'm gonna try and get that to happen. There we go. It's important that it's seated. You don't want to have to come back in here for a coolant leak. Now put this mount back in here. I have all the bolts ready to start. I'm going to start these two top ones in first so that I can let go. Start in these two bottom ones. This one I put some anti-seize on because I noticed it was corroded. I also cleaned up the corrosion. The other ones seemed fine, so I let them be. But if yours are corroded, clean them up, replace them if necessary, and coat them with some anti-corrosive coating. The 16mm headed bolts get torqued to 40 foot-pounds. And then the 13mm headed one, that small one down there, gets torqued to 18 foot-pounds. That's it. Now let's get the thermostat housing back on the engine. Start in one of the bolts, and the other bolt is right underneath. The torque for both of these is 106 inch-pounds. This converts to about 8.8 foot-pounds, so they're not very tight. Make sure that if you don't have anything to torque it that low, you just snug it by hand with a small ratchet. Give it about 1/8 of a turn after it bottoms out. Right here, you'll notice this valve. It's basically just a bleeder valve to help bleed the cooling system. Make sure that when you install this, it's tightened. You can always loosen it up later with a long screwdriver from the top. But if you start with it loose, well, you may have coolant coming out of it once the air has come out without you realizing. So it's better off starting with it snug, but make sure you don't completely crush it down. It has an O-ring underneath, a rubber O-ring, and if you squeeze it down too much, it'll actually just crush that O-ring and it will not seal. So make sure that the O-ring doesn't start bulging out the sides. If it does, back it off. It's supposed to just be flush. Let's put the upper radiator hose back on this thermostat housing. Slide the clamp back over. And as always, I like to line it up with exactly how it was before. Now bring this piece in and slide it down. If you need to adjust the height of your engine at this point, go ahead and do so that you can line all of these up and make sure they start in smoothly by hand. You don't want any of these to cross thread. And I'm going to start these two mounting nuts on as well. I'm going to tighten the bigger bolts first, just snug them up, then we'll torque them, of course. And I'm going to let the engine down just a little bit at this point, just so that it rests on this engine mount here and doesn't actually pull upwards on it. Snug those up. I went back up just so I can relieve pressure off of these so that we can properly torque them now. The torque for the bigger bolts, the 16mm headed ones, is going to be 59 foot-pounds plus an additional 45 degrees of rotational torque. I have a torque wrench that does read degrees. If you don't, 45 degrees is 1/8 of a turn. But of course, we'll start with the 59 foot-pounds of torque first. Now these already feel very tight, so I may not be able to go the whole 45 degrees, but I will try my best. Okay. That's it right there. Now let's relieve pressure off of our support, the floor jack that is, so we can put pressure on this engine mount so we can finish tightening these two properly. The torque for these two is going to be 18 foot-pounds. Now grab the air filter housing. You're going to want to line it up with this cold intake piping first. And looks like mine is, well, not so secured anymore, so I'm going to have to guide it in here, kind of. But once it goes in there, you should be able to drop the rest of the filter housing into place. Oh, there we go. That's just seated. Let's re-secure these. Make sure this slides on. It's got this little notch here that needs to line up. And then with an 8mm socket, tighten up the clamp. When you tighten these clamps, you want to make sure that you don't crush them completely. Otherwise, the gear in there will strip out, and then you'll have to replace it. So just go until it's snug. Make sure it's fully seated all around, and you should be good to go. Okay. If you can't move it once it's snugged up, you know it's tight enough. Resecure the power steering reservoir with this 13mm mounting nut. Snug that up. Now let's fill up the cooling system. Refer to your owner's manual for the proper type of antifreeze that you should be using. I also have this spill-proof funnel here, which is going to help me, well, not only not spill, but it's going to make this the highest point in the cooling system, which means air will naturally want to rise to the top. Let's fill this up all the way until it stops bubbling. To bleed the cooling system, we're now going to start the engine. As it runs, I'm going to turn the heat all the way to the hottest point on both. I'm going to turn the blower on low. We're going to want to make sure the AC is off. We don't want AC. I'll make it blow on the vents just so I can feel the heat. If you have rear HVAC controls, I'm going to do the same. Blower on low, heat on high. This will circulate all the coolant through the heater core. You're going to feel the heat once it warms up. And of course, as it does warm up, we're going to want to pay attention to our temperature gauge, which is on the left side of your dash. You're going to want to make sure it doesn't go past the halfway point. If it does, it's most likely an air pocket. So shut it off, let it cool down, and then start it back up. Once it warms up to full operating temperature, we're going to shut it off. Now let's cap this off. If you're using this funnel, it's easiest if you just squish on the upper radiator hose a little bit, plug up your funnel, and then remove it as you let go of the upper radiator hose. That will usually make it so that you're not spilling much at all. On the driver's side of your vehicle, near your battery, you'll notice this is your coolant overflow tank. If yours wasn't full all the way, like mine already is, you're going to want to add coolant until you reach the max line. Don't go over it, but make sure it's full. Now remove your coolant funnel if you used it, or the adapter at least, and put your radiator cap on. Make sure you click it on twice. It has 2 stages to it. There you go.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.